No time for introductions. Today we're looking at one of the most famous, most important, and probably most misunderstood organizations on Earth, the United Nations. Almost every country in the world belongs to it. The United States is there, China is there, India is there, Luxembourg is there too. There are 193 member states in total, and inside the General Assembly, every one of them gets exactly one vote. United States, 1. China, 1. India, 1. Luxembourg, also 1. Suddenly, international politics looks surprisingly democratic. Big country, small country, nuclear power, tiny island state, one country, one vote, beautiful. But do not get emotional yet. Walk down the hallway and you find another room where international equality suddenly comes with terms and conditions. Welcome to the Security Council. 15 countries sit here, but 5 of them have permanent seats: the United States, China, Russia, Britain, and France. And these 5 countries possess something the other 188 UN members do not have: the veto. Basically, the diplomatic version of a giant red no button. For major Security Council decisions, the other members can say yes, definitely, let's do this. But a negative vote from one permanent member can stop the resolution. So the United Nations begins with a strange contradiction. Countries are equal, except some countries are clearly more equal than others. George Orwell would recognize this situation. But here's the important part. This strange decision was not an accident. It was built this way deliberately because humanity had already tried international cooperation once before, and the first attempt went terribly. World War I ended in 1918. Europe was exhausted. Cities were damaged. Empires collapsed and millions of soldiers and civilians were dead. Governments looked around at the destruction and reached a fairly reasonable conclusion. Maybe we should not do that again. So in 1920, they created the League of Nations, an international organization designed to give governments somewhere to settle disputes before those disputes turned into wars. The idea was simple. When countries had a problem, they would not immediately reach for armies. They would meet, negotiate, establish rules, and try to solve the problem together. One important idea behind the League was collective security. If one state attacked another, other states would respond together. International politics had officially become a group project. And if you have ever participated in a group project at school, you may already have some idea where this story is headed. The League had meetings, it had committees, it had procedures, it had rules. It could issue condemnations that probably sounded extremely serious on expensive stationery. What it did not have was enough power behind those rules. Then the 1930s arrived, and the weaknesses of the system became impossible to ignore. In 1931, Japan seized Manchuria in northeastern China. The League investigated the situation and criticized Japan's actions. Japan's eventual response was essentially to leave the organization. International diplomacy had discovered the geopolitical version of leaving the group chat. In 1935, fascist Italy invaded Ethiopia. The League imposed economic sanctions, but they were not strong enough to stop the invasion. Germany, meanwhile, began dismantling the political settlement created after World War I and rebuilding its military power. The leagues protested. Governments issued warnings. Armies kept moving. Your concerns have been noted. Tanks continue forward. But there is another part of the story that history classes sometimes rush through. These conflicts were political and ideological, but economics mattered too. The Great Depression had devastated international trade, banking, employment, and industrial production. Factories closed, banks failed, unemployment exploded. Governments became afraid, and frightened governments began asking a dangerous question: what if we cannot depend on the international economy or on other countries? Japan depended heavily on imported resources and increasingly looked toward expansion in Asia as a way to secure raw materials and markets. Mussolini's Italy wanted empire, prestige, resources, and greater economic independence. Fascism promised that national strength could overcome economic weakness. Nazi Germany connected recovery, rearmament, territory, resources, and military expansion. Economic policy and preparations for war became increasingly connected. Economic insecurity fed nationalism. Nationalism encouraged expansion. Expansion frightened neighboring countries. Fear encouraged more military preparation. Congratulations! International politics had created a feedback loop in which everyone became less secure while trying to become more secure. Economic crises do not automatically cause wars. History is never that simple, but economic crises can change what governments believe survival requires. Cooperation can begin to look dangerous. Compromise can begin to look weak. territory, resources, and markets can begin to look like national security. The League could condemn this process. It could not reverse the political and economic forces driving it. The institution had rules, the state still had armies, and when rules collided with armies, our armies usually won. Then came World War II. Apparently, one world war had not provided enough evidence. By 1945, large parts of Europe and Asia were devastated. Warsaw was shattered. Berlin was ruined. Tokyo had burned. Millions were dead or displaced. And now, humanity had introduced nuclear weapons into international politics because apparently the previous version was not stressful enough. Governments were no longer asking only, how do we prevent another war? They were beginning to ask a darker question. How many more wars can civilization survive? So they tried again. In 1945, delegates from 50 countries gathered in San Francisco to design a new international organization. They argued about voting, they argued about sovereignty, they argued about rules, and most importantly, they argued about power. Because the League had taught them one enormous lesson: an international organization without the world's strongest countries is not especially useful. The United Nations had never joined the League of Nations. Germany and Japan had left it. The Soviet Union was eventually expelled. In other words, the countries with enormous military power kept disappearing from the organization that was supposed to manage international security. That is a serious design problem when your organization depends on those same countries to enforce its decisions. So the architects of the United Nations made a bargain. The strongest powers would remain inside the new organization, but the organization would recognize that those powers had a special position. That bargain produced the permanent members of the Security Council and one of the most controversial features of the UN system, the veto. The veto was partly the political price of keeping the strongest states inside the system instead of watching them leave whenever the institution challenged them. The founders were not building a world government. Countries were not agreeing to surrender their sovereignty to some global president sitting in New York. The UN could not eliminate power politics, so it tried something much more practical: put power politics inside a conference room. That distinction matters. The United Nations was designed to manage relations among sovereign states, not replace those states. Today, the United Nations has 193 member states, and the General Assembly is the broadest forum in the organization. Every country gets one vote, at least on paper. The General Assembly debates international issues, passes resolutions, builds coalitions, and can demonstrate how much international support a position has. But most General Assembly resolutions cannot simply be enforced against countries the way a law can be enforced against someone inside the United States. Instead, one of the Assembly's most important products is something less visible: legitimacy. Legitimacy sounds weak because nobody has ever seen an aircraft carrier named Legitimacy. But politically, legitimacy can matter a lot. A vote can influence alliances. Alliances can create sanctions. Sanctions can affect trade and financial markets. Economic pressure can influence political decisions. So no, a General Assembly resolution cannot physically stop a tank. But international power is not limited to tanks. Now enter the Security Council. 15 members deal with major questions of international peace and security. 10 countries are elected for 2-year terms. 5 countries remain permanently: the United States, Britain, France, China, and Russia. Basically, the international system has a VIP section whose guest list was largely written in 1945. And think about how much the world has changed since 1945. Germany became an economic giant. Japan became an economic giant. India became the world's most populous country. Dozens of colonies across Africa and Asia became independent sovereign states. The Soviet Union disappeared. China transformed economically and politically. The entire structure of the world economy changed. But the 5 permanent Security Council seats remain. Institutions have memories. They often preserve the political world in which they were created, even after the world outside them has changed dramatically. The Security Council gets most of the attention because war gets attention, but much of the United Nations works far away from television cameras. The Secretariat handles the organization's daily administration, research, coordination, and operations. Diplomats prepare negotiations. Officials gather information. The Secretary General does not command an independent UN military, but can use diplomacy, mediation, public pressure, and sometimes the simple ability to keep governments talking. The International Court of Justice in The Hague handles legal disputes between states, while other UN bodies coordinate economic, humanitarian, development, and social work. None of these organizations rule the world. That is the key point. There is no giant global police station hidden underneath the UN headquarters. The UN depends on its member states for money, troops, enforcement, sanctions, and political support. Countries created the United Nations because they needed cooperation. But the United Nations needs those same countries in order to produce the cooperation. That is the paradox. And now we arrive at the question students usually ask. Does the United Nations actually work? The annoying answer is sometimes. The sometimes is much more interesting than a simple yes or no. We understand why we need two competing ways of looking at international relations, liberalism and realism. Liberalism starts with an observation that is easy to miss because wars dominate the news. Most countries spend most days not fighting each other. They trade. They fly through each other's airspace. Ships cross oceans. Banks move money. Students study overseas. Governments negotiate agreements. Modern international life requires an enormous amount of cooperation that almost never becomes breaking news because countries successfully followed shipping rules today is not an exciting headline. Liberals argue that institutions make this cooperation easier by creating rules, expectations, meetings, information, and predictable ways of solving disagreements. Trade also gives countries something expensive to lose. The more connected economies become, the more costly a major conflict can become. The liberal argument is not that countries become best friends. Nobody's making friendship bracelets in the Security Council. The argument is that governments can discover that cooperation sometimes serves their interests better than conflict. Realists look at exactly the same world and immediately notice something else. There is no government standing above sovereign states. Inside a country, police and courts can enforce laws. Between countries, there is no authority with the same guaranteed power. There is no international 911 number that guarantees someone will save your country if your survival is threatened. So states ultimately have to protect themselves. Realists call this self-help. Countries can sign treaties, they can have allies, they can join international organizations, they can collect extremely impressive conference badges. But when leaders believe national survival or major security interests are at stake, security usually comes first. Military power matters, economic power matters, geography matters, technology matters, resources matter, and alliances matter. From this perspective, the Security Council veto suddenly stops looking like a weird flaw and starts looking like international politics written directly into institutional rules. The Charter contains ideals. The veto contains power. Both live inside the same building. Now we can test these theories against actual history. In 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. The Security Council authorized military action under the UN framework, and an international force led largely by the United States entered the conflict. A liberal looks at this and says, collective security worked. One state was attacked, other countries responded, and international rules mattered. A realist looks at the same conflict and says, welcome to the Cold War. The United States intervened. China entered the war. The Soviet Union supported North Korea. Korea became one battlefield inside a much larger geopolitical struggle. So was the United Nations defending international law? Yes. Were major powers also defending strategic interests? Also yes. International relations has an annoying habit of giving you two correct answers at the same time. 6 years later, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain, France, and Israel attacked Egypt. Britain and France still had enormous economic and strategic interests connected to the canal. Then something unusual happened. The United States opposed the invasion. The Soviet Union opposed it too. Getting Washington and Moscow to agree on a major crisis during the Cold War was basically an international achievement unlocked. International pressure increased, and the attacking forces eventually withdrew. A liberal can look at Suez and say diplomacy, international pressure, and the United Nations helped stop the conflict. A realist asks a different question. Why did that pressure work this time? One major reason was that both emerging superpowers wanted Britain and France to stop. Institutions mattered. The distribution of power mattered too. The UN worked partly because powerful countries allowed it to work. Remember that sentence. Now jump forward to 1990. Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, invaded neighboring Kuwait. The Security Council condemned the invasion, imposed measures against Iraq, and an enormous international coalition eventually formed. Iraqi forces were driven out of Kuwait in 1991. For liberals, this looked like collective security finally doing exactly what it was supposed to do. One country invaded another. International rules were violated. Countries organized through the UN system and responded. Sounds pretty convincing. Then the realist walks into the room and immediately looks at the map. Kuwait is not exactly sitting in the middle of nowhere. It sits beside enormous oil reserves and inside one of the world's most strategically important regions. Iraqi control of Kuwait could have dramatically increased Iraq's economic power and changed the balance of power across the Persian Gulf. So yes, the coalition defended international law. It also defended oil supplies, regional stability, and strategic interests. Principles? Yes. Oil? Also yes. Power? Definitely yes. Welcome to international relations, where the correct answer is very often all of the above. Now we can return to our original question. Does the United Nations actually work? The frustrating answer remains sometimes. But instead of asking whether the UN works, ask a better question. When it does work, and when does it fail? Liberalism gives us one answer. Institutions make cooperation easier by creating rules, expectations, information, and regular ways for governments to communicate. Realism gives us another answer. Those institutions still operate inside a world where power is distributed very unequally. If powerful countries agree, the United Nations can suddenly look extremely powerful. If powerful countries disagree, the exact same organization can suddenly look helpless. Same building, same charter, same microphones, completely different result. This is why thinking about the United Nations like a machine can be misleading. We imagine pressing a button, getting a result, and declaring the machine broken when nothing happens. But the UN is not really a machine, it is an arena. It is a place where governments bring disagreements, bargain, build coalitions, threaten consequences, negotiate, language, and occasionally spend 6 hours arguing over one sentence. That may sound useless, but enemies talking in a conference room is still very different from enemies communicating with artillery. Sometimes keeping the conversation alive is the achievement. And this leads to one of the bigger lessons of international relations. Power does not always arrive wearing a military uniform. Sometimes power is a tank. Sometimes it is an aircraft carrier. Sometimes power is access to a market, a loan, a sanction, technology, or an alliance. Sometimes power is a vote. Sometimes it is 50 governments standing together and saying, "We do not recognize what you just did." Nobody fired a missile, but something politically important just happened. A resolution cannot physically stop a tank, but it can affect legitimacy. Legitimacy can affect alliances. Alliances can produce sanctions. Sanctions can affect economies, and economic pressure can change political calculations. Power travels through international politics in ways that are harder to see than an army crossing a border. Modern power moves through armies, money, trade, technology, information, alliances, financial networks, and international institutions. The United Nations is not above that system, it lives inside it. And this may be the biggest mistake people make when judging the UN. They expect it to behave like a world government even though it was never designed to become one. The UN has no independent army waiting in New York. It depends on governments for troops, money, enforcement, sanctions, and political support. Which brings us back to where we started. The General Assembly, 193 states, one country, one vote, formal equality. Then walk into the Security Council, 5 permanent members, 5 veto powers. Suddenly, international politics remembers that states may be legally equal, but they are definitely not equally powerful. One institution, 2 realities, and strangely enough, both are real. Sovereign equality is real. Unequal power is also real. The United Nations never solved that contradiction. It was built around it. In 1945, the founders wanted rules, but they lived in a world of power. They wanted equality, but they needed the great powers to participate. They wanted peace, but they could not eliminate geography, resources, fear, ambition, sovereignty, or national interests. So they built a compromise. Give almost every country a voice, but give the strongest countries enough power that they would actually remain inside the institution. Is that completely fair? Probably not. Was it politically realistic in 1945? Much more so. And the tension between what is fair and what is politically possible sits at the heart of international relations. Countries cooperate and countries compete. They sign treaties and sometimes ignore them. They defend international law and sometimes interpret international law very conveniently. So perhaps the United Nations survived not because it defeated power politics. Clearly it did not. The Security Council itself is practically power politics with nameplates. What the UN did was give power politics another place to happen: a room, a microphone, a vote, a negotiation, and occasionally a very uncomfortable diplomatic lunch. Sometimes nothing happens. Sometimes governments argue for 6 hours and produce one paragraph, which sounds ridiculous until you remember that the alternative can involve tanks. And sometimes countries actually reach an agreement. So the better question is not simply, does the United Nations work? The better question is, when national interests collide, what makes governments continue talking instead of fighting? Liberalism tells us institutions can give governments reasons to keep talking. Realism reminds us that those conversations often last only while governments believe talking still serves their interests. Maybe understanding international relations requires both ideas. One explains why countries build the table. The other explains why they sometimes stand up and walk away from it. The United Nations cannot make that choice for them. No international institution can completely erase power, geography, resources, security, fear, or ambition. The chairs belong to countries. The votes belong to countries. The armies belong to countries. And ultimately, so do the decisions. The room is waiting. The real question is not whether the table exists. It is whether countries, especially when things become difficult, choose to stay at it.